BioCentury This Week is brought to you by Jeito Capital, a leading global independent private equity fund with a patient benefit-driven approach aimed at financing and accelerating the development of groundbreaking medical innovation. Jeito's unique investment strategy combines significant capital and collective expertise to support companies and their management teams, ranging from clinical development to market access for cutting-edge innovations, with one main objective: go faster for the patient. Learn more at jeito.life.
AACR. It's the gift that keeps on giving for us here at BioCentury as we keep diving into the content from the American Association for Cancer Research's annual meeting, which wrapped last week. Today, we're talking about degraders of SMARCA2, a target that has been considered nearly undruggable with traditional small molecules. Lauren Martz will be joining us with an update from the conference. And we went deep with Nobel winner David Baker on protein design. We'll have the takeaways from Editor-in-Chief Simone Fishburne's Q&A with Dr. Baker. And pharma lobbyists and CEOs were in panic mode over the weekend as President Donald Trump pushed congressional Republican leadership to include drug price controls in reconciliation legislation. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and joining me today on the BioCentury This Week podcast are my colleagues.
Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
I did mention AACR. There's another meeting coming up in June that might interest you out there in biotech land, and that is BioCentury's Grand Rounds Conference. It takes place June 4th through the 6th, conveniently in Chicago, right after ASCO, which I know many of our listeners will be attending. You can join us to engage thought leaders at the academia-industry interface, and we'll be talking bottlenecks in translation and much, much more. It's not too late to register for the conference, and if you have an innovative biotech that's raising seed money, Series A money, Series B money, and our early stage, join our presenting class. You can reach out to me. We have a few slots left to present at the meeting. Okay, AACR. Lauren, welcome back to the podcast. I am keen to learn about what is going on with SMARCA2, and I'm also keen to know whether I've got that right. SMARCA2, or do some people say like SMARCA2, or where do you go with that?
Thanks, Jeff. I spoke with several companies working on this target, and the majority do say SMARCA2. I've also heard SMARCA2. So let's go with SMARCA2 for today. Yeah, this stood out to me as an interesting target at this meeting because, first of all, degraders were big at this meeting. You know, we've seen some clinical validation, a lot of clinical validation at this point for established targets of targeted protein degraders. And there's a lot of movement toward the new targets, toward applying this modality to the undruggable, which is the original promise of it. SMARCA2 is important, I think, from a precision medicine point of view, and also, you know, as a synthetic lethality target. So this is one of two main catalytic subunits of the chromatin remodeling BAF complex. So basically, cells need either SMARCA2 or SMARCA4 to have normal gene expression and to survive. Some cancer cells, about 10% of non-small cell lung cancers, have mutations in SMARCA4. That means if you can selectively target SMARCA2 and knock that out, then you could kill cancer cells, but not kill healthy cells that still have SMARCA4 expression. The problem is these targets are almost exactly the same, so using traditional small molecules has been very difficult. At AACR this year, this target came up over and over again in the abstracts. There are quite a few companies that are at the translational stage with SMARCA2 degraders. There are also some small molecules that are progressing. Foghorn and Eli Lilly have figured out a way to selectively target it with a small molecule, although the selectivity may not be as high as what you could get with a degrader.
And I think this is a really interesting development because, as far as I can understand, they've known about the target for a while. And of course, the big promise of targeted degradation, of targeted protein degradation, is that you can reach targets that you couldn't reach otherwise by sending them to the trash can, kind of thing. So what are the kinds of molecules that they've created? How have they gone about designing these agents?
Yeah, back to the first part, this is a target that's been known for a while. It's something, SMARCA4 mutations are part of all of those screens that, genomic screens that are done for non-small cell lung cancers already. And patients with these mutations tend to respond pretty poorly to standard of care therapy. So it's a very big unmet need, and it's an important target. There are different ways that companies are designing degraders against the target. Prelude Therapeutics, for example, has one of the, I'm not going to say traditional because this is a newer modality, but one of the more traditional bifunctional degraders that binds the VHL E3 ligase. That's sort of more what you would see with the traditional PROTACs. We saw at the conference that Plexium, which has a monovalent direct degrader, unveiled the E3 ligase target of their degrader, which is something called DCAF16. The more traditional degraders, they'll bind the target. It doesn't have to be the active site, which is what can give you more selectivity because the active site is often highly conserved with similar targets. They also bind the E3 ligase and can direct that target to be marked for degradation. The monovalent direct degrader concept, the therapeutic itself is only binding the target. Once it's bound the target and created a ternary complex with it, then it recruits the degrader. So this is a newer design. It's possible that this may end up having less resistance. The cancers may not mutate to avoid binding that E3 ligase, which I think is important. It remains to be seen which works better when these are taken into patients and we have data.
Hey, Lauren, just one more thing, because first of all, I want to point out that I find this particularly interesting when something we talk about a lot. So you've got targeted protein degradation, which some people call a new modality. And then you've got synthetic lethality over here, which is, I don't know, let's call it a strategy, let's say. But what you've really got, in fact, is this orthogonal, two different areas of innovation in drug development or drug discovery, moving ahead together and reinforcing, one reinforcing the other, which is why I still believe that drug development should be going faster than in the past. And I know Steve is going to bring us back to earth with the realities of regulation and policy and how that can change drug development. But just on this front, it seems that there's a sort of focus on it. Any particular reason why this is coming up now among a few different places at AACR? Any big breakthroughs that have led to this?
I think the progress that Foghorn has made and the deal that they attracted with Lilly, and again, this is a small molecule, I think that's just drawn attention to this as a target and as a place where, we could potentially do better with a more selective modality against the target. I think the progress with KRAS inhibitors has also sort of opened the door to selectively targeting things that we couldn't selectively target before. And, these specific mutations in lung cancers where we're screening patients and finding the mutations, and this has created a therapeutic opportunity in KRAS. This is a very similar idea, targeting SMARCA4 mutant cancers. These are cancers that don't respond very well to traditional therapies, just like KRAS inhibitors. They don't have a lot of overlap with the actionable mutations that we're screening for and treating with targeted therapies, with the exception of KRAS. So there's a lot of interest in combining inhibitors or degraders. There are quite a few degraders that are described against KRAS at AACR this year too, as a new therapeutic strategy for the subset of lung cancer patients that just doesn't do that well.
All right, and Lauren's story will be out early this week. Simone, I can't help but notice you look like you're in an airport lounge or something like that. You've kind of got a different vibe this morning. Where are you abandoning us to run off?
Abandon is a big word, Jeff. I may yet
It
do
is,
that, but
actually.
this isn't it yet. Okay,
Okay.
that's
Thank
when I run
goodness.
away. That's when I run away to Belgium next week. No, I am. Thank you. And my audio might be a bit different. I am en route to Boston from Washington D.C. Just saying that there should really be a high-speed rail that there isn't. So I'll just make a plug for that. That
What do you think
other,
this is, China?
exactly every other developed country has. But anyway, that aside. I'm going to the USAIC, the USA India Chamber of Commerce, a meeting that the president of USAIC, Karun Rishi, puts together every year with all the big names. And, it's really an incredible thing that he does. But that's not what you wanted to ask me about, is it, Jeff?
Right, yeah, you've been a jet setter. I'm really hoping that you're going to take in a game at Fenway, because I know you went to Seattle to see the Mariners play, and you made a
Dude,
little bit
I'm
of
all
time to
about the
talk to
Warriors. I'm all
it's
about the Warriors today, Jeff. I am all
oh my
about the
goodness,
Warriors today.
what a game. Buddy Hield,
Not to mention Jack Draper, who made it to the finals of Madrid.
yeah,
But
that's
yeah.
Jack's big, but I got to go with Buddy, because we call our star Steph, we call him Batman. Playoff Jimmy Butler, playoff Jimmy is Robin. And whenever Buddy goes big, they're like, "Are you the new Robin?" He's like, "No, I'm more like Alfred," which I kind of like that. But you were talking to David Baker out in Seattle last week. Obviously, he's something of a big deal. And you were talking about what's next for protein design. What'd you learn?
Right. So let me just say, I had interviewed David Baker a few years ago at the same event, which is a Life Science Innovation Northwest meeting in Seattle. And to interview him now, post Nobel Prize, he was a very brilliant man then. He's still a very brilliant man. And we have actually interviewed him in between at BioCentury. And that's relevant because I want to make the point that the field that he's in, which is now AI-guided protein design, he's been in protein design for a long time. And he's moved from Rosetta, which is a sort of a physical way of doing it, based on physical programming, to AI-guided. And it's a phenomenally interesting area, and it's just moving at rapid speed. So I just want to make 3 points maybe from this. One is that my colleague, Karen Tkach-Tusman, our colleague, she had interviewed him in 2022, and she talked about 2 cutting-edge sort of strategies in his lab. And I asked him about those. They're called constrained elucidation and in-painting. And I asked him about those now. And he was like, anybody who's joined my lab in the last 2 years has never heard of those terms. We have moved so far beyond. And that doesn't really happen very much when I talk to people, that something that was so big 3 years ago, 2 years ago, is already history. And he said they're really building the toolbox. But I just want to make the point, because it sort of relates to what Lauren was talking about in terms of innovation and new kinds of molecules. He thinks that AI-guided protein design is going to have sort of 2 waves of impact. The first one is really, really improving much faster on the ability to do things that are in the line of sight now. So much faster, better, creation of proteins by design, that you can dial in the right properties, what they are. And then the next wave after that, which is very exciting, is just building molecules that don't even exist right now. And so sort of saying, here's a problem, in the circulation, that we might have certain molecules that do this, or binding, you're creating catalytic sites where you wouldn't have thought of them, and creating sort of protein engines. The ability to just build by design things that don't exist right now is where he thinks this is going in the future. All of that said, I said, if I have this conversation with you in, a few years' time, will it be completely different? He said, absolutely. So who knows? Who knows what that's really, how it's really going to play out? But yeah, there's some very, very interesting things going on in AI-guided protein design and in his lab.
And of course, David Baker, he was recipient of the 2024 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his contributions to computational design, along with 2 members of DeepMind, a unit of Alphabet Inc., for their AlphaFold protein structure prediction method. Well, you did allude to the fact that you're going to Belgium, and I just want to quickly note that on our sister podcast, you spoke to the managing director of VIB, also known in English as the Flanders Institute for Biotechnology, VIB, of course, a key player in the life sciences innovation ecosystem in Flanders, Belgium. Everything from research and tech transfer to building and funding startups. Any quick high-level takeaways there before we venture off into the constrained hallucination that is Steve's specialty in Washington, D.C. politics and policy coverage?
Well, actually, there's a host of things I'm very excited about, and I'm going to talk about the ones that involve me, because they're the ones I actually know most about. So the opening session is the theme setter, which really sets the stage, and I had this amazing panel. And what we're going to be looking at are some things I'm working on right now, which the idea this year is that Europe is in a very complex moment, or biotech is in a very complex moment, I should say, and Europe really has an opportunity. And I think even today, there's articles coming out about how Europe could be attracting scientists from the US. You know, there's a lot of things that Steve has been talking about and is going to talk about today and going forward regarding the regulatory landscape here. And then on top of that, what we have is just rising innovation in Asia. And so I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive, which we'll be publishing as well, on the deal landscape with deals from Asia and where Europe fits into that. And, you know, is Europe capitalizing on that trend as well? And the answer is yes. And then I have a couple of fireside chats, one with Anya Koenig from Novartis Venture Fund, which is going to be super fun. And the other is just going to be phenomenally interesting with Jean-Pierre Leterre, who is the CEO of ESO Biotech, a local hero. That company just got bought by AstraZeneca. And I can tell you it's going to be really interesting because I just had a prep call with him, and he is phenomenally interesting and dynamic. So yes, those are the three things I'm particularly interested in.
Excellent. And so that, of course, our BioEquity Europe meeting, now in its 25th year. I believe the event sold out. So you can look ahead to the 2026 BioEquity Europe if you want to get in on that. And to prepare, we have a special edition of the podcast will be out later this week, previewing the event. We have a guest from McKinsey. We have the great Hank Jos, who can tell you quite a few things about the Belgian biotech ecosystem. And we also were joined by one of our colleagues from EDB, which puts on the meeting with us. But do check out our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show, for that conversation that Simone had with Jerome van Biervlet. I'm sure I completely butchered his name, but he's a very...
Yes, you have. It's it's Van Beervliet. I spent a lot of time.
That is, yeah. He quite a good humored fellow, so he seemed game for anything, and he spoke quite a bit about how Europe needs to fulfill its, what he said was a long overdue mission in biotech, as the U.S. is, well, frankly, we'll hear a bit about it right after this break. Uncertain territory, I guess that's the diplomatic way of putting it.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Grand Rounds. BioCentury's R&D conference will return in 2025 to the US and Europe to debate key bottlenecks in translation and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us in Chicago this June after ASCO for the second BioCentury Grand Rounds US, and in Cambridge, UK this September for the inaugural Grand Rounds Europe. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
We are back on the BioCentury This Week podcast. Steve, most favored nation. 3 little words that are anything but when it comes to our industry. I know your phone has been ringing off the hook. Phones no longer have hooks. It's probably a good thing. What are you learning, Steve?
Pharmaceutical industry CEOs and lobbyists, they went into DEFCON 1 over the weekend. I haven't seen them in this much panic ever before. They're really, really, really concerned. So what's happened is that the White House, President Trump, is demanding that Republicans include provisions in the budget reconciliation legislation that would prohibit Medicaid from paying more for drugs than other industrialized countries pay. This would create massive savings, and it would obviously would help Congress offset the costs of tax breaks. More importantly, it would address Trump's deep conviction that the rest of the world is taking advantage of the US by paying far lower prices for pharmaceuticals than Americans. There's some resistance to the MFN concept among congressional Republicans, but Trump's GOP allies have expressed support, as have Democrats. The effects would go beyond Medicaid. It would really echo through the whole.
Steve, let me just jump in. You said that there are some congressional Republicans who are sort of pushing back. Why don't you spell out for us what their argument against most favored nation is?
Well, in the first Trump administration, there were several Republicans, prominent ones, who pushed back against what he calls most favored nation, which, by the way, is a kind of strange thing to call it, but it's international reference pricing. They said that it's importing European drug price controls into the United States, that it would inhibit innovation by slashing revenues for companies, and it's something that they strongly opposed. There's a story out this morning, I haven't confirmed it, but I believe that it's true, that Josh Hawley is co-sponsoring legislation with Peter Welch, that's a conservative Republican and a liberal Democrat, that would create a most favored nation pricing policy in the United States. Brett Guthrie, chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, told reporters that he favors the proposal. And so the thing to think about is it's not just a Medicaid. Okay, so first, the impact on the industry from cutting Medicaid spending would be dramatic. Medicaid spent about $51 billion on drugs in fiscal year 2023. This policy could maybe have that, so maybe that would be a $20 billion hit right there. But it doesn't stop there. The 340B drug discount program, the ceiling for the prices that are paid under 340B is the Medicaid price, net of rebates. In 2023, 340B ballooned to about $66 billion. If that gets halved, that's another $30 billion. So there you've got something like $50 billion a year in cuts in spending, and the industry is convinced that a most favored nation policy that affects Medicaid and 340B would spill over into the private payers as well.
All right, Steve, let me be Joe or Jane public here. Crimea River, that's what they're going to say. They are not going to have any problems with the idea of that kind of cut to industry. And so what I want to ask you is, this came up in the first Trump administration. How has the industry, if at all, been preparing, or has it just been like, we escaped it then, ostrich, head in sand, it's not coming?
So what came up in the first Trump administration actually wasn't nearly as serious as this. It was bad enough, but it was limited to Medicare Part B. And it was proposed in a way that was, it was illegal. It was challenged in court. The Biden administration withdrew it before the court challenges got terribly far. But it was really going to be serious for the industry. This would be a far bigger blow. The industry's been at the White House. They're on Capitol Hill. Pharma is having a kind of emergency meeting of its board tomorrow evening in Washington. So they're, like I said, they're going into DEFCON 1 and doing everything they can to try to deflect this. They only need to get a handful of Republican members of Congress to oppose it. But the president has been pushing very, very hard on this. Republicans, basically, they're being told that even if they don't like it, they have to stay on board, because if they splinter on this, then they'll splinter on other things, and the whole budget reconciliation bill will be put in jeopardy. And it's really the core of the Trump administration's legislative agenda for the next 4 years.
Actually, just one follow-up there. So if the budget reconciliation, because there's obviously a lot of things going into that, if that's held up by other factors outside of this industry, does the whole thing go away? Or is this MFN going to be part of the next 3.5 years?
It's never going away. No, it's not going to go away. The only way that it could be said to go away is if the pharmaceutical industry comes up with some solution that convinces President Trump that the United States isn't being taken advantage of by countries that are paying far lower prices for pharmaceuticals than the United States.
So, Steve, in your piece on Friday, you mentioned that pharma execs are a little bit more hopeful that they may win, I guess, a small skirmish on the Inflation Reduction Act.
That's right. Well, they don't consider it a small skirmish. It's a very big deal for the industry.
Yeah.
I think that MFN is even bigger. so you can look at it that way. But yeah, there's a pretty high degree of confidence among industry lobbyists and CEOs that for the so-called pill penalty is going to be included in budget reconciliation legislation. The 9-year threshold for negotiating the price of small molecules for Medicare is going to increase to 13 years. The pay for it is most likely going to be an increase in the so-called pharma fee under the Affordable Care Act. That's a subsidy or a tax that industry pays to help make the Affordable Care Act more affordable. I think, as I said, there's pretty strong confidence that that's going to happen in this legislation.
All right, and we have a few minutes left. I want to check in on FDA, as I know your coverage has been vital in the past few months, given all the turmoil at the agency, which really is at the heart of our industry. What's the latest, Steve?
So I reported, you probably remember, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, about plans for reorganizing FDA, plans that former FDA commissioners said would have been disastrous if they did them. FDA Commissioner Marty Makary gave an interview in which he said that he has rejected those ideas. He's not only is he not going to put those reorganization plans into effect, he said he's not going to do any kind of reorganization at all, which also disappointed industry. I mean, industry really didn't want to see the reorganization that some of his staff had proposed. They believed it really would have been disastrous for the industry. But I think that there's also a sense of disappointment if Makary really doesn't do anything. The other issue, and what I reported on Friday, is if he doesn't do anything, it's going to be extremely challenging to actually make the FDA function with the staffing levels that he's got now. 3,500 staff have left the agency since January 22. That's about a quarter. There's a lot of staff who are planning to leave, including review staff. And he's got vacancies, either completely vacant or people in acting capacities in many of the most important jobs in FDA. The Office of the Chief Counsel is vacant. CBER, the Biologics Center's director, is acting. The CEDAR director is acting. The Office of External Affairs director is empty. The Office of Minority Health and Equity is empty. The Office of the Chief Scientist is in an acting position. The head of the Human Foods Program is also in an acting position. The Office of Veterinary Medicine director slot is vacant. The Center for Tobacco Products director slot is vacant. And the Chief Medical Officer slot is vacant.
It's a lot. And our colleague Meredith Durkin-Wolf, head of our research, worked with you, Steve, to create a great chart that really lays out the top of FDA's leadership. And there's a lot of blank spaces there. So if you want to get a visual on what Steve just said, BioCenturyPodcast.com, you can look at that FDA no reorg story. Anything else, Steve? Anything else on your mind?
There's a lot going on, but I think that one other thing to think about really briefly is the president's budget proposal. As expected, it includes massive cuts, about 40% to the NIH budget. And there's a sense of, well, frankly, doom at the NIH and the intramural program, not only because of the size of the cuts, but because they're being instructed to reorient their activities and grant-making activities to the Make America Healthy Again agenda. And that represents a massive shift from the priorities that NIH has had for generations to a kind of an ideologically based orientation. There's a concern that areas where the United States has led science for generations will be cut back or possibly even abandoned.
Sobering words. Well, hopefully Europe picks up the mantle. We know China certainly is racing to do so. And I don't know, Steve. Doom. That's a big word. Simple word, but effective. All right. Wish we could leave things on a brighter note, but not today. We will be back next Monday with another edition of the BioCentury This Week podcast. Steve, thank you for detailing what's going on in Washington. Lauren, of course, with your AACR coverage. And Simone on the go. Always good to have our editor-in-chief on board. You've been listening to the BioCentury This Week podcast, which is produced by Cole Travis of our creative team. And we would like to thank the Kendall Square Orchestra for creating the music for all of our podcasts.
BioCentury would like to thank Jeito Capital for its continued support of our BioCentury This Week podcast and our 25th annual BioEquity Europe Conference this May in Bruges, Belgium.